So, Ari Aster's Eddington is finally here. It's in cinemas across its in-film location, political hotbed and real-world theatre of the damned, the US of A. And I think it's fair to say, before it even hit the silver screen, that this film was more than a little bit controversial. It had heads wagging when its genre as a modern western was made apparent, and even more so when it was revealed to be a COVID pandemic piece. And when the script was released, fans and fast-fingered Redditors alike were quick to point out how different the film was for the horror director and how its political storyline left much to be desired and dissected. It's not the film people expected of Aster at all, veering further from horror and having less clear political motivations than people thought the seemingly liberal director would produce. So why did Aster make this film? What is he trying to say? And what, if you'll excuse my French, the absolute is Eddington actually about? Not a great way to start a video about COVID. My best friend pointed out to me that I cough like a child because I cough with my tongue out like this. Ari Aster has made 4 movies, that's not a 4. Smash horror debut Hereditary, the beloved and equally successful folk horror Midsommar, his anxiety odyssey Beau is Afraid, and now Eddington. He's without question known as a horror director, and his furthest foray from the genre with Beau is Afraid left people a little cold. So unlucky for some, Eddington follows Beau down the path of satire and dark comedy. This isn't a horror film at all. There is some violence, yes, but not for a second does this belong on the horror shelves at your local Blockbuster, if your local Blockbuster existed. Showing my age! Tonally, Eddington is Coen Brothers meets Jim Jarmusch. A little bit silly, a little bit strange, a little bit serious, but by and large still very Ari Aster. Throughout all his films, he has incredible attention to detail, and you'll know if you're a fan of, dare I say, the best channel to have ever existed, Novum, that the themes, philosophies, and symbolism of his work runs deep. In broad strokes, the director has covered mental illness, familial relationships, grief, and anxiety, but his films are so incredibly densely packed with symbolism relating to historical events and mythologies that they run a lot deeper. Everything is exactly the way it is for a reason. From the painting in Danny's apartment of a folkloric princess who loses herself in the woods, foreshadowing Danny's path in Midsommar, to the 3 female heads held by Payman as a revelation of the ultimate disregarding of women in bids for power in Hereditary. The layers are near inextricable, but Aster knows exactly what he's doing. Eddington looks to be tackling division and conspiracy in its broad strokes. It's a COVID pandemic movie, so those ideas are hard to avoid. It explores the divisive nature of our current political climate, how it is experienced and exploited by all. Midsommar extensively parallels its cult to white nationalist fascist groups, like the far-right groups gaining traction now, so Aster choosing to tackle these ideas explicitly in Eddington isn't actually that surprising. And Aster isn't pompous enough to assume that only the politically conservative can have ill intent. The darkness in Eddington is evenly spread, and that's far from the only subversive material being served on this Western platter. Let's see what the audience thinks. Ultimately, more than a director, Aster is a man with complex thoughts and feelings, and in being so, Eddington is a complex film. But today we are going to get to the bottom of what Eddington is about, both practically and thematically. You need not scratch your head, friend, for I have gone bald for the both of us. Quickly before we begin, this video is in paid partnership with Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, personal management, sewing, writing, and more. I'm currently in the process of switching editing softwares in making this video. Get ready for some snazzy titles and transitions. And Skillshare has provided exactly the classes I'm looking for, taught by approved professionals like this course by Marcel Patillo. And beyond just classes, classes, Skillshare offers learning paths like this one, doing the work of curating sequential collections of classes for you. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so give it a click and start learning today for free. We're obviously going to get into spoiler territory here, so proceed with caution. I also don't know if I will have access to any of the footage from the film, but that may mean this video is mostly my face. How lucky. Eddington is a 2020 set contemporary Western drama that takes place in the fictional town of Eddington, USA. And it focuses on the rivalry between Joaquin Phoenix's police sheriff Joe and Pedro Pascal's mayor Ted. To zero right in, the film opens with a homeless man holding a dead pigeon, running around the dusty outskirts of the very deserted-looking Eddington. Cut to Sheriff Joe in his car watching videos on his phone. He gazes at a pic of his wife Louise, played by Emma Stone, and we immediately get a sense that this man is a little lonely. Quite literally in the dark, on the outskirts of his own life, longing for his wife but lacking a physical connection to her. And this comes into play big time as we learn that Joe and Louise are not physically intimate and likely haven't been for much of their marriage, as Louise has SA trauma. On his lonely perch, Joe is interrupted by the Pueblo police, the indigenous land that borders Eddington, who tell him to mask up. Joe grumpily argues that he isn't really down with masking without particular cause or reason. He just feels that he doesn't want to and doesn't want to be told what to do. This is a disenfranchised man, feeling his autonomy further stripped away from him by nationwide regulations, intrinsically tying his emotions to his anti-lockdown stance. We then meet Ted for the first time, who is a people's princess kind of character. Mayor and local bar owner, he is called upon Joe to deal with the homeless man who is relentlessly banging on the window at his bar. There's a back and forth that allows us to see some immediate hypocrisy from Ted, who says he isn't serving patrons, but he's having a council meeting, and that's why there are people in the bar, which under regulations should be closed. He says they aren't distancing or masking because it's a private establishment, even though he criticizes Joe throughout the film for not masking himself. The homeless man ends up smashing through the glass, and Joe is forced to physically wrestle with him, which is captured on camera. We then go home with Joe and find out that Louise's mother, whose name I actually can't remember, and guess what? I should have Googled it, but I didn't. Yeah, you don't pay me enough to Google this shit. You actually recently haven't been paying me at all because no one watches my videos anymore. Louise's mother is living with them, having moved in before the lockdown and effectively being stuck there. Basically every single thing this character says is conspiracy theorist lingo, which Aster definitely uses as a comedic beat, but for anyone who has a family member or friend like this, they know how much this talk can actually be incredibly distressing to be around. Louise herself is clearly depressed, spending most of her time in bed or making these freaky little figurines that Joe buys from her Etsy shop to make it seem like she has customers. I cried in the cafe that I wrote the script in when I typed that line, because is that not the most like sad but gorgeous thing ever? And this is so pertinent to establishing who Joe is. He might be the unlikable anti-masker, but he's also a man just trying hard to make the people that he loves feel loved. I'm gonna cry again. Around this point in the film, we introduce one of our major subplots, which follows a kind of dumb average teenage boy called Brian. Brian has a crush on a girl who is very vocal about Black Lives Matter and other social causes, notably the causes that were most prominent in the public consciousness in 2020, and she has in turn a crush on the mayor's son who supports the same ideologies. We get Joe's big breakdown after he defends a man for not wearing a mask in the supermarket, takes off his own mask, and has an altercation with Ted in the supermarket in which Louise and her strange reclusive behavior is brought up. And deepest apologies if this is incorrect, because I have only seen the film once, but this, I believe, is what sets Joe off on a rant on Instagram Live, where he declares that he's gonna run for mayor. Now, this does not sit well with Louise. She really doesn't want him to be mayor, and she doesn't want him to be in conflict with anyone. We have another subplot. I just became fully Irish for a second. we have another subplot here with Louise taking interest in a sort of radical leader figure played by Austin Butler, who was actually barely in the movie. He's a non-secular charismatic leader of what is effectively a radical thinking cult. Free your mind, see the truth, kind of social conspiracy woo-woo mumbo-jumbo. Sounds like a Ben & Jerry's ice cream flavor. But Louise has been watching his content, goes off to a seminar that he's hosting nearby, and ends up bringing him and some of his followers back for a very awkward dinner with Joe. Butler's primary function in the story seems to be drawing Louise further from Joe and being another voice of liberation for society's victims, which is a theme we're going to talk about later. From here, Sheriff Joe is called to attend a BLM protest. There's a very uncomfortable scene where the teenage girl berates her adult ex-boyfriend cop, Michael, who is a black man, about how he's not standing up for his people, he's standing on the wrong side of history, and how she feels so torn up about her own whiteness. During the riot, Joe finds out that the video of him that was taken earlier tackling the homeless guy is being spread online. Without context, he comes across as a violent police officer, and that is the narrative that his opposition is using against him. Even though we know he didn't want to get physical with the guy in the first place because we saw the entire scene. Now, the mayor's son ends up yelling at Joe during the protest and calls Louise crazy. Joe is fuming and rebuts this, saying something along the lines of, "Do you know what your dad did?" It's rebuts a word, rebukes, rebuttals. To make things even worse, Joe makes a public speech in which he accuses Ted of being a saying that he got a teen Louise pregnant and forced her to have an abortion. Without taking a second to consider the potential ripple effects, he tells his buddy who's been filming the speech to post it online. After Joe's claims come out in the video, Louise makes her own video vehemently denying this, and he gets home to find out that she has left him. We can assume that Louise has SA trauma, given how uncomfortable she is with physical touch. It's heavily alluded to in the film, and we know that she and Ted had a fling as teenagers. Her mother is adamant that Ted Louise, attempting to gaslight Louise throughout into believing this herself. But I think it's implied, given the absence of Louise's father, that any kind of SA trauma she has is more likely to have stemmed from an assault by him, or at least some father figure associated with her mother. Her mother is fixated on the idea that Ted assaulted Louise so that she doesn't have to feel accountable for Louise's fractured mental health. If she acknowledged the reality of her own partner assaulting her child, she would likely feel some responsibility and emotional consequences. And this is not a woman who likes to live in reality, as we've seen. She likes to go wherever it's comfortable for her, and whatever makes her feel like she's not to blame for the outcomes of her own life. Joe is then immediately called to a noise complaint at the mayor's house. He shows up, everyone has obviously seen the accusation video, and is pretty mad at him. Firework by Katy Perry is playing, Joe tries to turn it off, Ted slaps him, and Joe leaves. Joe retreats, but he's angry, he's fuming. And he's truly in the thick of his own mess now, having done irreversible damage to his own life by acting on frustrated impulse. It's at this point that the film takes a major turn, and I'm not going to describe this in minute detail, as we'll get into dissecting the film's final act later on. But in the first real shocking moment of the film, Ted and his son are shot by a long-distance firearm while in their home. And we cut to the culprit lying in the dirt on the outskirts of town, and it's Joe. He has killed his biggest rival. He also graffitis "No justice, no peace" on the wall, which is a recognizable BLM slogan. I was initially a bit baffed by this, but it very quickly becomes clear that Joe is desperately trying to make it look like the crime was done by someone politically liberal to avoid attracting suspicion himself. So the next day, Joe is called to the crime scene as sheriff, and he's like, whoa, how crazy this happened. What's going on? Hey, look at this teenage girl's bag that's here. It was probably her. The Pueblo police are also there, which Joe is really pissed about, but they do have jurisdiction. The Pueblo cop says they found a bullet shell out in the desert, and Joe immediately pivots to framing his fellow police officer, Michael, who I mentioned before. He ends up planting the murder weapon in Michael's car, and Michael is then detained at the Eddington station. Michael is obviously pretty angry about this, and it becomes very clear that the other white police officer that we've spent time with throughout the film has been holding some strong biases against Michael the entire time. So he immediately follows suit with Joe and turns on him. Yes, shocker, he is a racist. Michael is also accused on the basis that his ex-girlfriend was now hooking up with the mayor's son, and Brian, the mopey teenage boy who has a crush on the girl, had actually sent a picture of her and the mayor's son hooking up to Michael in the hopes of getting him beaten up or something so that he could swoop in and get the girl. I'm sorry if that sounds a little complicated, but basically this ego war between the two teenage boys leads to a picture of the ex-girlfriend and the mayor's son being on Michael's phone, and the white cop uses this as further bait and justification to make it seem like Michael's kill had a motive. Amidst all of this, the Pueblo cop sees Joe's handwriting on a whiteboard and makes note of the fact that he writes his E's in the same peculiar way that the No Justice, No Peace sign was written at the mayor's house. Cut to a shot of a jet plane soaring over Eddington. There are Antifa signs on board and a buff guy doing press-ups. This is a super important shot, so log that in your smooth, juicy brain. We have another scene of Joe engaging with some public unrest, and then when he returns to the police department, Michael is no longer in the jail cell. And this is where things start to get really crazy. Ookie cookie. Joe and the racist copper head out to find Michael, and they find him on the edge of town. In a very similar scene to the ending of Spiral from the Book of Saw, Michael is stitched up to make it look like he's doing something dodgy when he's actually being held captive and is bound and gagged. He's saying, "Don't come near me, they're gonna kill me, they're gonna kill us," but the cops can't hear him through the duct tape, and they can't see the duct tape in the dark, so they bowl over to him and end up stepping on a landmine. This blows up, completely obliterating our racist buddy cop and burning another BLM slogan into the ground. Joe at this point is obviously pretty freaked out. He's scared, he's confused, he makes it back to the center of Eddington town and finds that he is being chased through the streets by masked men. And not the nice spittle-reducing COVID masks. We're talking full-faced ski masks concealing their identity to both Joe and the audience. They have a big black car with some big old guns. Joe is using his own big gun. There's a lot of shooting back and forth in which the masked men shoot the Pueblo cop, who had finally by this point figured out that Joe is the one who murdered Ted. This scene is the film's crescendo, and it ends with Joe getting stabbed in the head by one of the masked men, and the masked man then being shot and killed by none other than Brian. We watch Brian dropping to his knees and putting his hands behind his head as the police roll on up. And as this shot goes in, we realize that what we're watching is actually a video on a phone. In quick succession through internet clips, we learn that Brian has become somewhat of an internet hero come lame-o podcaster, influencer bro, having survived the Eddington mass shooting. There may have been a more eloquent way to put that. Now, I actually haven't mentioned this yet, but early on in the film, there is talk between Eddington locals about how a data center is being built in their town. And it's actually quite pivotal to the story, although I must confess that I haven't really figured out how it's pivotal to the themes, and perhaps it isn't. Or perhaps it is, and I am not smart. But it's a year later, and the centre has been built, with Joe, who survived his injuries and is now mayor, overseeing the grand opening. Less lucky for him, he has been left with serious disabilities and can no longer speak or walk. Everyone has come together for this opening, including Pueblo representatives and other councillors that we met throughout the film, and no one is wearing a mask. Everyone appears to be united again in Eddington. The very final scenes see Louise's mum acting as Joe's mouthpiece and carer, and we see them living in their now shared home. Joe's nurse is clearly sexually involved with Louise's mum, and they all share a bed together, which is pretty uncomfortable for Joe. And pretty depressing. Heartbreakingly, we watch as he watches a clip of Austin Butler spouting more "We Live in the Matrix" BS and sees a pregnant Louise in the video. She looks happy and healthy, and her pregnancy shows that she's bucking and sucking once again. The film closes with a shot of the valley where you can see the data centre and Eddington town still looking strangely empty and isolated. And that's Eddington, wrapped in a bow. Ooh, moonbeam ice cream. That been stuck in anyone else's head for like 2 weeks. Is that a country song? Would Benson Boone survive Eddington? The important questions. Wave. This is the closest thing I had to a cowboy hat. I'm not gonna wear this. Okay. As established earlier, Aster isn't really a one message, one takeaway kind of guy. There's a lot to sink your teeth into here, and no doubt there will be a million things I miss in this discussion in an attempt to avoid making a 10-hour video. But let's get into the guts of it. What are the most significant themes that we're working with here? I think the first major theme observed in Eddington is the entanglement of the personal and political, and how this quickly leads all types of people to act unreasonably, if not dangerously. We see this in the relationship between Joe, Louise, and Ted. While Joe is frustrated with masking regulations, it's his dissatisfaction in his marriage and subsequent anger at someone that he holds responsible for that spurs him on to run for mayor. He then makes a wild claim that has absolutely nothing to do with policy in order to defame his opponent. Within hours, his own mayoral campaign has made its underlying intention as a Ted smear campaign clear. Joe is engaging with personal beef in order to progress himself politically. This is flipped in the teen storyline, which instead sees Brian engaging with the political, reposting his black square and attending protests for personal gain, to get the girl he likes to pay attention to him. In both scenarios, the personal and political are entangled in a way that destroys any intent for good. Joe's focus isn't really on lessening COVID regulations or supporting his wife. Brian's isn't really on dismantling racism or seeing if there's any genuine connection with the teenage girl. They both indulge in their dissatisfaction and allow that to spur on their political choices until they are so enmeshed that they can no longer be separated. The characters' relationships to social media also plays a huge role in this. In both cases, posting online is the tool being used to begin a new narrative. In Eddington and in reality, the online world is fast-moving and constantly regenerating information to form new narratives. And Joe's angry rant shows how easy it is for someone to harness social media to spread lies and accusations intentionally, and how disconnected the screen makes us feel from our own actions. It's as easy as hitting a button, much easier than having a conversation face to face, and we see how quickly Joe crumbles when he and Ted are actually brought together. Another side to social media's inherent danger is lack of context. The clip of Joe tackling the homeless man is used against him to feed into the narrative of aggressive cops, even though we've seen throughout that he's a pretty soft, fearful character. I think this spotlights a lack of critical thinking in our media consumption. Damage Damage doesn't always begin with proactive lies. Sometimes it's simply a matter of the camera only being able to capture so much, and our own biases drastically influence how we perceive contextless clips. I couldn't help think of Jordan Peele's Nope when walking out of Eddington. Incidentally, it's another contemporary Western horror hybrid, but I think the connective tissue between the two films comes down to spectacle. Humans exploit tragedy and effectively everything else around us for entertainment. But we don't have control over how the media that we have created from it continues to move. It's Gordy the Chimp, it's Jean Jacket. We don't understand what those creatures are capable of. And our error is our hubris, believing that we are running the show, but we're not. And in this case, we are the show. We are the spectacle. In Eddington, iPhones and socials are weaponized for personal gain. The characters entangled in both performance and exploitation. The arms, eyes, and mouth of the beast acting as one horrific spectacle. When Nope criticizes industry, whether it be Hollywood, meat eating, animal exploitation, I believe Eddington charges the individual. And it warns us that the beast is not in our control. I think Aster also wants us to think about the parroting of politics and political jargon, specifically with the left-wing idealism and angst of the younger characters. The film should make us question if we are really doing more than these teenagers. Posting a queer book or black square is shorthand signaling of who you are and what you stand for that doesn't require work. It's the social media feedback loop that we use to reassure ourselves we're doing something about the issues that surround us, opting for self-satisfying parroting. But oftentimes it's not really doing anything other than establishing our own image. And to be really clear, I'm not saying anyone should stop engaging with online activism specifically, just pointing out that it can't be all you do. You've got to walk the walk behind closed doors and focus on dismantling your own biases, not just critiquing those of others. I think at times in Eddington, it can feel like Aster criticizes the left more than the right, which isn't sitting well with some people. I've seen people online questioning his own intentions and political allegiances. But I don't believe his criticisms necessarily mean that he is against the political left. His choice to levy criticism at all kinds of people shows that he's not leaning into divisive rhetoric, and that's a good thing. Because as is in the name, divisive rhetoric tends to lead to further divides. We need to be self-critical of our own hypocrisy, intent, and actions so that we don't lose sight of achieving our actual goals. And speaking of the divide, another major theme of Eddington is how our political divides were emphasized by the pandemic. Again, we're talking both in Eddington and in our reality. Things were pretty rocky between the left and the right in the USA before COVID, but the post-pandemic divide is crazy. A huge part of how this divide came about is that the COVID pandemic reinforced everyone's sense of individual victimhood. I'm a victim because I'm sick and I need people to wear masks. That was me in this narrative. Shout out to my fellow autoimmune sufferers. But others are saying, I'm a victim because I'm being forced to wear a mask and it's difficult for me because I have breathing issues. I'm a victim because I've had to stop working due to distancing rules and I'm struggling to support my family. I'm a victim because I've been fired for not being vaccinated as someone who doesn't support the healthcare system due to past ineptitudes or perceived ineptitudes. Everyone had, dare I say, valid reasons at this time to feel they were the victim of the pandemic. But the dangerous outcome of this is feeling that everyone else is inherently your opposition. And without safe and empathetic communications between people holding different viewpoints, the divides between us exponentially deepen. I think Eddington serves to remind us that so many people right now have the same sentiment that the system is wrong. The big issue is that we're all talking about different systems. systems. The system might be the left, it might be the mainstream media, it might be Western medicine, it might be the Conservative Party. And I do feel like I need to make it clear that I'm mostly speaking to the COVID stuff here, because there's no way around the fact that racism and sexism, for instance, are wrong, being grounded in the belief that there is a hierarchy of superiority between humans. Anyone who thinks that their opposition is innately less than, less human, less worthy, less deserving, has stepped into objectively ugly territory with their beliefs. And I think the film subtly alludes to this being the director's stance based on which characters do the most damage. He's not saying the sides are equal, but he's exploring the ugly, awkward nuance which we usually ignore. I think Joe and Ted are intentionally coded by Aster as our standard Western movie bad guy and good guy, locked into a territorial battle. Joe is unlikable, presented as scruffy and unsociable, while Pedro is smiley, charismatic, and smooth-talking. But the nuance is, without a doubt, inviting us to question what really makes one good and one bad. Sure, Joe is a grumbly copper, but he's also a man having trouble at work with a police force that's barely keeping afloat and a wife at home who won't even touch him. Point is, he's not a billionaire businessman holding the cards. He's a pretty pathetic dude, channeling his own frustrations into political ideology in the hopes that it might lift him out of the hole that he's in. Joe doesn't feel like the bad guy. It's as clear as day to him that the bad guy is the system-disrupting sex offender, and we've seen how the story of his life has brought him to the point of believing that. But whether you see him as good, bad, or something else in between, there is a truer evil at play in Eddington. Which brings us to dissecting Act 3 and answering the big question, who are the men in the masks? I think the third act of Eddington, the descent into madness that follows a terrified Joe through the streets of Eddington and ends with some pretty serious damage to his dome, firmly reflects his paranoia throughout. He has fallen so deeply into this idea of himself as the victim that we see him literally come under attack. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy led by his obsession with his own victimhood. The girlies might say he manifested it. Act 3 also shows us the outcomes of indulging in anger and violence. The chaos is indicative of a loss of perspective, no longer knowing what you're fighting for, just knowing that you're in a fight. The violence is senseless. In a similar fashion to Beau is Afraid, it's farcical at this point. An absurdist sequence of gunfire, lost limbs, and exploding heads. Joe is truly lost in the sauce, unable to disentangle the mess and reverse any of the damage done. I think this speaks to how our polarized politics creates an environment in which near nothing but destruction is achieved. Bigger, uglier, and more drastic action becomes the only communication between sides. And again, this is a slightly wobbly message to endorse because I definitely still think that people who believe women shouldn't have bodily autonomy or believe that ripping immigrant families apart makes their own lives better are in the wrong. I think it's significant that the Pueblo cop and Michael, the two people of color in the film, don't actually cause any harm. They are just victims to the violence. And that leads me to believe that Aster isn't trying to say that these figures in the groups they represent are equivalent to Joe, an angry white guy causing serious harm. But the point stands. The further we are divided, the more extreme our environment becomes. And all Joe's actions up until now have achieved nothing but cause more chaos. Chaos which attracted the attention of a certain group of masked men who saw it as the perfect opportunity to swoop in and weaponize the existing turmoil for their own political causes. And this is the real zinger of Eddington. Who the hell was on that plane. The shot feels so out of place when it first pops up in the movie that you know it's gotta be important, but it's never referenced again directly in a way that concretely explains what's going on. But it introduces us to the masked men, and it tells us the most important thing we need to know about them. And without understanding this fact of the film, we're massively at a loss for understanding its intended meaning. So, no more foreplay. Who are the guys in the masks? This took me a moment to understand in the cinema, and maybe that's just me, but initially seeing the Antifa signs and the BLM graffiti, I was like, oh, these are the extreme left pulling a stunt. But actual Antifa protesters, i.e. anti-fascists, would not be flying on a private jet. And the film is utilizing the association between out-of-touch billionaires and private jets to signal this. Moment of silence for Sydney Sweeney and Ellie Goulding, who attended Jeff Bezos' wedding. See you in the inferno, girls. The masked men on the plane are actually fake Antifa protesters being flown in on a private jet to cause chaos in Eddington during its 5 minutes of fame caused by the social media virality of Joe's antics. This explains why the BLM message burnt into the ground was done at the expense of a black man, because it was a setup. And if anything, they were trying to make it look like Michael was the one who burnt it into the ground and bombed the other 2 white police officers. The masked men are making it very clear that they want the left to be held responsible by the public and the media. Their goal is to make it look like a left-wing terrorist attack is taking place. So we can certainly say that the figures behind the attack are in opposition to the left, but not the small-town conservative type like Joe. Rather, the kind of opposition who hold enough money and power to enact such a horrific event. The kind who do such cruel things with full consideration, not as an emotional response. Unlike everyone else in the story, we don't ever get a sense of who they are as people. And they were presented to us in that way, so we would have no sympathies for them. Without the nuance that the other characters are afforded, I feel we can quite definitively say these guys are bad. And I think this is really the thesis of the film. You may be fighting with your neighbours, viewing people in your community as enemies because you hold different views, but those who really hold the power are the faceless billionaires, not the men like Joe, who are just as likely to fall victim to their meticulously practiced destruction. And we are reminded of this in the film's final scenes. Joe is extremely disabled, he's lost his wife, he's lost his only friends. He, a small-town sheriff, became a pawn in a much larger game that he wasn't prepared to enter, and it destroyed him. It's the characters who are shown to have no real morals or stakes, like Brian or Austin Butler, who benefit, because they don't actually stand for anything and will exclusively support what supports them. It's very much a modern grifter's mindset, to be shaped by whichever hand feeds you. Basically, the film declares that there are 2 ways to win in this divided post-pandemic world. Either have money, something Joe did not have, or care about nothing and see who supports you, which Joe was too emotional, vulnerable, and personally motivated to do. It's painfully reflective of the current leadership in the USA, by one pussy-grabbing, Christian-loving, not himself a Christian, supposedly swamp-draining, billionaire tech bro employer, and below-average golf player. I can't remember his name. Oh well. We did it, folks. That is Eddington, directed by Ari Aster, explained. Needless to say, it's a pretty distinct pivot from the director's previous works, focusing fully on comedy and cultural criticism. And did it work? Well, reviews are super mixed. I was lucky enough, as I mentioned before, to see this at Cannes, and I was pretty much the only person in the group I saw it with who liked it, and the only person who walked away from the cinema with a smile on my face. But even as a fan of Eddington, I still found myself pining for the haunting beauty of Hereditary and Midsommar. I don't think Ari Aster has totally lost the plot, Though I think it's clear to see across his entire filmography, including his short films, that if anything, Hereditary was the outlier in how much it resembled a traditional horror film. I personally hope horror is the field that he returns to, but I think Asters' career is in some ways just beginning to take shape, and we'll come to see that it's his dark sense of humor, incredible attention to detail, cultural criticism, and obsession with tragedy that actually defines his work, not the horror genre. As for the meaning of Eddington, I think the film takes a pretty firm stance, even if it takes pulling back a few layers to get there. This is a film that reminds us that we are all just the little guys, and the little guy always loses in games played by greater powers, even if you've aligned yourself with them. The film is not declaring there aren't real reasons that we become divided, but it seeks to remind us there are bigger enemies than each other. And that is that. For my thoughts. Did I miss anything that you noticed? Did you have the same takeaways, or do you think Eddington was trying to say something else entirely? I'm always eager to hear your thoughts. And honestly, I am a little bit nervy about expressing my own political opinions online, so please be considerate and kind in your responses. Thank you again, Skillshare, for sponsoring this video, and thank you to all of my amazing subbies. Goodbye. Moonbeam ice cream taking off your blue jeans.